And my opinion on this is that it is our duty to create the conditions and to open the space for free choice, and it is the right of the individuals and families to use this open space. I think this is the proper angle how to look at it, and this will also help us to avoid the risk of social engineering or some naive legislative proposals which will not bring the desired results. It was also said here that where is the line between the FEM and labour market approaches. In the Commission we resolved this problem or this issue, that it is mainly my agenda, but we work in very close cooperation with Marianne Thyssen and the experts from the labour market sphere, because this package will also contain very important proposals which will reflect the modern trends in the labour market, and I am looking forward to cooperate on this with you, especially in the second half of this year when we will do the second round of consultations. Thank you.
La parola al relatore, onorevole.
Back to the rapporteur, Ms. Arena.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you for your statement. I know that you're working on this whole issue of reconciling public and private life. I would like to thank my colleagues. Thank you to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for working so hard in order to arrive at the different compromises which we now find in this report. I very much hope that the report will be supported broadly when we come to vote on it. For those who have called into question the competence of the Union in this area, let me remind you that we've had this directive since '96, and this directive has not been called into question in terms of the remit of the EU, and I think we should stand by that competence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Arena. Thank you too for the understanding you've shown. That brings that debate to a close. We're voting at 12. The next item is a declaration from Ms. Bearder on preventing and combating trafficking in human beings. Over to the rapporteur, Ms. Bearder.
President, this debate must focus on the victims, people taken from their homes, forced or deceived into exploitative, demeaning and often dangerous situations, at risk of violence, abused and too often arrested for crimes that they have been coerced into committing. The most marginal in our communities are the most vulnerable to exploitation. Imagine the young Eastern European woman, smart and ambitious, seeking a good life with opportunities. She meets a young man, falls in love with him and his promises of a good life together. She follows him to London only to find that he's brought her to a brothel. Her passport and personal possessions are taken. She's pushed into a bedroom with no sheets on the bed and is beaten if she refuses any client that is brought to her. She's too brutalised to make any decision about escape or where to seek for help. Her boyfriend has deserted her, probably recruiting other victims. Other girls in the brothel are like her, young, scared, beaten, raped and isolated. The men who come to the brothel don't ask questions, not concerned about the bruises or the fact that she can't speak the language. The EU trafficking legislation is now 5 years old. It's an excellent framework for the protection of victims and is a great example of how EU countries can come together to address issues that can't be tackled alone. But many countries are slow implementing this. They and we are failing the victims across Europe. Victims experience terrible brutality and suffer many long-term physical, mental and emotional effects. I'm confirming the need that victims are properly provided for with healthcare, accommodation, material assistance and legal support. This legal support should include claiming compensation, which victims are entitled to but very rarely get. Legal support should be available and free of charge. Victims who have been exploited are in no position to pay for that help. I'm also calling for an extension of the 30-day minimum recovery and reflection period, particularly for victims of trafficked for sexual exploitation. The effects of this form of trafficking demand specialist support over a very long period. In the UK, we have 45 days, but even this is a short time for survivors who've been repeatedly raped over many months. We owe them more than just this month of recovery. Professionals need to be trained to spot trafficked people. This is clearly failing now. This includes frontline law enforcement and border staff, judges, magistrates, healthcare professionals, counsellors, teachers and others. Sadly, we will never know how many victims are not found. We must also step up awareness campaigns for groups vulnerable to the traffickers, as well as the wider public, to help them spot the signs of trafficking. Trafficking in human beings is happening where you all live. Open your eyes to the signs of trafficking. We should suspect trafficking when we spot sleeping bags in restaurant kitchens or factory workers working long hours in poor condition. It's in the porn movies, the brothels, where the girls can't speak the local language and never leave to go to the shops. The directive asks member countries to consider criminalising the knowing use of services of trafficked people. To me, it's scandalous that this is not already a crime. Where else is it acceptable for someone to knowingly engage in an illegal act but not be prosecuted for it? I've been pleased that I have been able to work on this report and to play my part in stamping out this vile crime. I look forward to listening to the coming debate. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Berder. And now, in name of the Libe Committee, Mrs. Björk.
Well, in my earlier job, I worked in fighting the traffic of women. I worked with the police, prosecutors, and survivors of prostitution. Now, what I learned from this, I've tried to turn into the text of the European Parliament, which they're going to vote on today. And I want to emphasize certain important points. The first is we have to have different strategies for different types of human trafficking. The most common form in Europe is for sexual exploitation. Even, of course, there is also for forced labor, as the report also covers. We also have to have a gender perspective. Those who are exposed are women and children. We have to strengthen the rights for those who are exposed to this, as Mrs. Bearder said. They have to have all possible support and the right to a residency permit. Colleagues, we have to fight those who make profits from the trafficking, and we have to fight the demand. This is the key to the work, and the report does say that very clearly. And when we talk about demand, I'd like to say something about the demand in the sex industry. This Parliament has to put down a foot and say the exploitation of women and girls and young boys isn't okay. And most of them get involved in this in children, and that's not acceptable, even if they then grow up. But instead of punishing those who are exploited, it's time to place the responsibility where it lies. And that is the pimps, the bordel owners, and the sex purchasers. And I know that it's radical here in the House to think that men shouldn't have the right to purchase women's bodies, but we're living in 2016. It's time to take a more progressive position on equality between men and women. This is a question of feminism and human rights and for equality. To decriminalize those who are exploited and to criminalize those who exploit pimps and sex purchasers is an effective way of fighting demand. If you take away demand, then there won't be this human trafficking. This is a step in the right direction, that this report to criminalize those who purchase the services from those who are exploited by human trafficking. But we can go even further next time, and thank you for your cooperation.
Non posso concedere cartellini.
Unfortunately, we don't have time to take blue cards. We're too far behind schedule. And given the length of the debate today, we have to try to keep to time. I'm very sorry. Normally I encourage blue cards, but we are a long way behind schedule today. So, Commissioner Jourova, on behalf of the European Commission.
Honourable members, first of all, I would like to thank Madam Berder, the rapporteur of this report. I am committed to ensure that we will continue stressing the gender dimension of trafficking and ensure a victims-centred approach. With the same proactive manner, we will continue to ensure that European Union law and standards related to anti-trafficking efforts are properly transposed. Out of the 27 concerned Member States, 26 have communicated to the Commission full transposition of the Anti-Trafficking Directive. The one remaining, Germany, has informed us about a political agreement reached, and we are expecting information on the transposition soon. Our services are currently in the process of analysing the information officially notified by the Member States with the help of a compliance study. The report on the extent to which the Member States comply with the directive is foreseen to be presented by the Commission in the fourth quarter of 2016. The Commission has been particularly proactive in monitoring the transposition. Only 1 month after the transposition deadline in May 2013, the Commission had opened 13 infringements based on non-communication. In November the same year, the Commission had sent 4 reasoned opinions as part of infringement proceedings for non-communication. It was to Spain, Luxembourg, Italy and Cyprus. This demonstrates the commitment of the Commission not to hesitate in taking actions for ensuring implementation of EU law. The Commission will soon present the first report assessing the progress made in fighting trafficking in human beings. With this report, we identify areas of progress and achievement, but also expose gaps and efforts that are still to be made. Clearly, the EU has delivered, but still a lot remains to be done. Our message should be clear. We cannot allow people, human beings, to be treated like commodities. We must work together to ensure we prevent the crime from happening, because then it is too late. We must crack down on trafficking where it matters for them the most, on their profits. At the same time, we must ensure that we also crack down on the demand for services and cheap labour that fosters all forms of exploitation. And here we all have a role to play. We must ensure we do not foster a culture of impunity for those who exploit and use the victims. We must ensure that the victims are not treated like the criminals. And to do this, we must do it together, and I count on this Parliament to continue working in this direction. This year is a turning point, and there is only one way, the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Ora passiamo agli interventi dei gruppi politici.
Moving now to speakers on behalf of the political groups. First of all, Ms. Corazza-Bildt on behalf of the EPP.
Madam Commissioner, trafficking in human beings is the new slavery of our times. The figures are stunning and the stories are heartbreaking. Behind every story there is a human tragedy. It is time to stop impunity. There should be no hiding place in Europe for traffickers. The majority of victims are women and girls. To be exploited for prostitution in Europe, more and more are migrants. Trafficking is a serious organised crime and should be persecuted as such. It is a huge business with high profits and too low risk. The networks are sophisticated and cross-border. We should step up our common European response in all fronts. Police and judiciary cooperation, better sharing of information, strengthening Europol, Eurojust, Frontex, the hotspots, tracking the money and confiscate the assets of the traffickers. And of course, Member States should do more to prevent, combat trafficking and protect the victims, also on the internet. Increasing the sanctions, training officials, giving access to healthcare, including sexual and reproductive rights, assistance, psychological support for the victims, with particular attention to the most vulnerable, such as children. It is also very important to reduce demand and to criminalise the users of sex services. Mr. Chairman, the EPP Group will continue to be committed to zero tolerance against trafficking in human beings and keep women and girls' rights on top of our agenda. It is really time for them to be freed. Thank you.
Per il gruppo dell'Alleanza Progressista
For the Group of Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, Ms. Honeyball.
Micro, please.
Thank you. Thank you, President. This report is very timely. As more and more refugees and asylum seekers come to Europe, so more of them are vulnerable to trafficking. And we in this Parliament and the European Union have to have a two-pronged approach to the terrible issue of human trafficking. And that is, first of all, zero tolerance. We will not tolerate human trafficking in any form at all, whether it's women and girls, who are by far the majority of victims, or other people, human beings, who are trafficked for labour exploitation and other forms of exploitation. And we also, as part of the two-pronged strategy, need to focus on victims. And that, I think, is a difficult part of this. Most of the victims, as has already been said, are vulnerable women who have been trafficked away from where they came from and who face appalling abuse. But we need to make sure that we and the Member States provide adequate services for them so that they can come forward. We should do this because we should do it. We should also do it because victims can play a key role in identifying traffickers and making sure that those traffickers, the majority of whom, interestingly of course, are men, they can be prosecuted and convicted, because unless we address this, we will not wipe out trafficking. And we also need to make it a criminal offence across all EU countries to employ the sexual services and to use somebody who has been trafficked.
Per il gruppo dei conservatori e riformisti.
For the European Conservatives and Reformists groups, Mr. Gericke. Thank you, President. We're talking today about the Europe-wide fight against human trafficking. As rapporteur for the ECR group, I would say that this fight has to be a shared and common fight. I would call on EU governments to reflect on the fact that since 2011 we've seen abduction of children, drug cartels, human trafficking and surrogacy mother procedures which rob people of dignity, and we haven't adopted procedures on that. The situation since the refugee crisis has become even worse. At least 10,000 young refugee children without their parents have disappeared in Europe, at least 6,000 of them in Germany. Those are terrible figures. We've called here for decisive action. Human trafficking is normally the work of criminal mafia groups and must be subject to tough sentences. The same would go to forced labour and forced prostitution. Estimates suggest that more than 80% of prostitutes in Europe don't do so voluntarily. They're exploited and treated despicably, and this is something which should leave them subject to the full force of the law. On behalf of the ALDE group, Ms. Becerra-Besтеречea.
Thank you, Chair. Mrs. Jourová. First of all, I'd like to very warmly congratulate my Liberal colleague, Catherine Bearder, for the exceptional work that she's carried out with this report. Trafficking a human being deprives millions of people around the world of their dignity. It's important to recall that this is not only a violation of human rights, as recognized in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the Union, but that it's one of the most lucrative illicit businesses in Europe. The traffickers make billions of euros in profits every year. They deceive men, women and children to subject them principally to sexual exploitation, but thousands of victims are also intended for forced labor, domestic servitude and the extraction of organs. 80% of the victims are women, the majority young people deceived with false promises of jobs and then raped, dragged, locked up, beaten, threatened, indebted, stripped of their passports, blackmailed. In Europe, 140,000 women are trapped in networks of sexual exploitation. Now, for a problem of at European scale, of course, we need European solutions. It's essential to have the cooperation between Europol, Eurojust and national authorities in third countries with a systematic exchange of information between the member states. And then, a final idea. we still don't know the whereabouts of at least 10,000 unaccompanied minors who entered the European Union in 2005. It's not beyond the realm of possibility to fear that many of them have ended up as victims of human trafficking. Maybe the Commissioner could answer the urgent question that I submitted to her 3 months ago. What registered data do we have about these minors, their age, their origin? Will the new global strategy announced in the European Migration Agenda strengthen the functions of Frontex and Europol to combat the mafias which traffic with these refugee minors? Thank you.
Per il gruppo confederale della sinistra.
For the Confederal Group of the European United Left, Nordic Green Left, Ms. Kuneva.
Andres pedía.
Thank you. There are women, there are men, there are children who are all victims of trafficking around the world. I think it's of course very shocking to have to say this, but of course those who are responsible for trafficking see these individuals as ones that can be dealt with in this way. Only 1% of victims are apparently saved, and only 2% of perpetrators are sent to the courts and sentenced. There are action programs in place to try to deal with this phenomenon, but very few results because of conflicts with other European policy areas. Migration, for instance. Europe's refusal to open up legal routes for migrants. It actually means that migrants are pushed straight into the hands of traffickers. So we need to send out a clear message, it seems to me. Europe should not allow this kind of trafficking to continue.
For the group of the Greens European Free Alliance, Mr. Urtasun. Thank you. Every year, many thousands of people are the victims of human traffickers. This is one of the most lucrative types of business in the world. At the European level, we do have legislation, but it's not being properly enforced. When it comes to victim protection, when it comes to implementation of Article 18, providing public servants, including police and security officers who is in contact with human traffickers, to have access to training, and Article 8, which calls for the non-penalization of people committing certain crimes who are victims of trafficking. And for the time being, people who are considered to be victims are subject to proceedings. The directive also calls for certain measures from countries such as Spain, which are failing to do so. So we have to call for better enforcement of the directive. But Ms. Jourova, we also need to have better information. The Commission still hasn't given the information we need on implementation of the directive. And I would like to thank the Green Ms. Bearder for her excellent work. But I'd also like to call on you to make sure that you give us all the information we need.
Per il gruppo Europa della Libertà e della Democrazia.
For the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy Group, Ms. Parker.
Eurostat say between 2010 and 2012, over 30,000 people were victims of trafficking. According to Europol, over 10,000 migrant children are missing in Europe. The UK's National Crime Agency reported that 3,309 people were potential victims of trafficking for exploitation in 2014, an increase of 21%. Why are we seeing this modern-day form of slavery on the rise? Well, a UK government report in 2014 said free movement within the EU is extensively exploited by organised criminals to bring human trafficking victims to the United Kingdom. And in 2013, Europol even admitted that the free movement of people reduces the chance of detection of such crimes. So even the EU's agencies and cheerleaders say that free movement is the big problem. The EU has created the perfect environment for trafficking to flourish. I'm sure businesses for criminals couldn't be better with the open door European leaders gave in response to the migrant crisis once in Europe and the free movement of people. By encouraging millions of people to come to Europe, you're playing into the hands of the traffickers, both within and outside Europe. Whether it is individuals paying criminals to get them into Europe, or families sending off their children for the hope of a better life, the EU has put hundreds of thousands at risk of exploitation, endangered lives by encouraging an exodus across the dangerous Mediterranean Sea. But not satisfied with that, you want Turkey to join the EU and liberalise visas.
Opening the door to a country like Turkey, giving 70 million people access to the UK and Europe, will without doubt increase trafficking. There is a simple way to deal a blow to traffickers. It is to end the free movement of people, close down the Schengen area, and to stop open-door immigration. It is for member states to take back sensible control of their national borders and to conduct criminal background checks. If you want to deal a blow to trafficking, if you want to protect innocent victims, if you want to save lives and to gain a sensible, ethical control of the United Kingdom borders, then the only way, I'm afraid, is to vote to leave the European Union on the 23rd of June, I beg your pardon.
For the group of Nations and Freedom, Ms. Godin.
Thank you, Chair. Well, 80% of the victims of trafficking are women. It's time to combat pimping, forced begging, forced marriage, forced labor, or removal of organs, which is developing more major. And what does this report suggest? Penalizing the clients of prostitutes, sanctioning the employers who use forced labor, and to help the women who are victims. Have we thought about the consequences of this kind of measure? Well, to obtain papers, women will be systematically prostituted, reduced to slavery, or forced into marriage. So what might be the solution? Well, it's not the automatic regularization of the victims of trafficking. The solution is to fight against the traffickers, to control our national borders, to attack the consequences and the non-consequences, and then to show firmness and common sense. So I'll vote against this report because it doesn't combat the mafia network that exploits women.
Tiene ahora la palabra.
Teresa Jiménez Becerril Barrio.
Presidente.
Thank you, President, and thank you very much to the Commissioner. Ladies and gentlemen, 2 out of every 3 victims of trafficking are young girls like the ones I'm showing you here. Despite all the efforts that we're making in order to try to rescue them, unfortunately she has been sold, she's been exploited, she's had all her money taken away from her. Almost 80% of the victims of trafficking cross borders and they end up in Europe. They are victims of criminal organizations. They hold out false promises of work. Actually, they force them to go into prostitution, and many of these women end up either ill or dead at the hands of their perpetrators. We need to make sure that the Commission really takes stock of what the Member States are doing in terms of rolling out this directive against trafficking. We need to check whether Member States are stepping up to the plate, making sure that there's no impunity for the traffickers, saving these girls and women. We need to, of course, act against the perpetrators, the traffickers. We need to protect the victims, and we need to make sure that we protect those who cooperate with the police in particular. And we need to make sure that we can identify the victims, protect the victims, to make sure that they can escape this hell that they are living at the moment. And again, we need to make sure that there's no re-trafficking of these young girls and women. Finally, I think we need greater judicial cooperation, exchange of information between Member States, and we need to make sure that young girls such as the one I am showing you right now do not die as a consequence of our inaction. We need to make sure that there's also an addressing of the issue of demand. If sexual exploitation weren't a business model, then this young girl would not have ended up in a brothel. Please think about it.
Tiene ahora la palabra García Pérez.
Well, thank you, Chair. Commissioner. Well, in this House, we've talked about gender violence many times. And of course, that's very linked to talking about human trafficking and the trafficking of women, a violation of human rights. So, a way of seeing in our unequal society how women are used like goods. We've talked about purchasing, we talked about goods, we've talked about exploitation, and I think that we have to implement all the necessary tools so that countries are forced to establish the legislative measures and legal measures and police cooperation measures necessary to combat human trafficking, because we're talking about women above all. We've dealt with this question of refugees. We've seen how also in this case these organized groups are the ones who are utilizing women to make money. So if we talk about avoiding this kind of business, if we talk about avoiding prostitution, let's be aware that we have to eliminate demand. We have to implement measures against prostitution to avoid that women are bought and sold as if they were a good. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Ms. Rinke.
Liebe Kolleginnen, liebe Frau Kommissarin.
Colleagues, Commissioner, human trafficking isn't just a crime. It is in fact something that is a business model here in the European Union which flies against all of our values. And we're talking about millions of euros being made through this business model. And we must finally call the perpetrators to account. But one thing is for sure. As long as we have victims of human trafficking who are afraid of going to the court, afraid of testifying against the perpetrators, as long as that continues, we will not move forward. So this directive really needs to put greater pressure on the member states. We need to make sure that legislation which is in force is properly applied. We need to make sure that the victims get counselling, psychological support, physical support. We need to make sure that the perpetrators behind this business model are finally called to account. Thank you.
Grazie. La parola.
Thank you, Ms. Ayuta. Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, we support this report, even if many parts of it actually go beyond the powers, I think, of the FEM Committee. The dossier focuses in particular on two factors. First of all, the need for tough sanctions and penalties against criminal organizations, as well as individuals who are complicit with this horrible crime of human trafficking. Secondly, the need to provide better protection for the victims of human trafficking, who are primarily women and who are exploited in the most shameful way because of the economic and social circumstances they come from their countries of origin. We do regret, however, the fact that this report does not include an explicit reference to a particular form of human trafficking of young babies, something we have to talk about far more. I'm talking about surrogacy pregnancies. The Council of Europe has come out with pronouncements against this practice. In this House as well, last December, we adopted an amendment condemning this practice. So my hope is that we will have other opportunities to tackle this issue, which were once again women and young children are the prime victims of.
Grazie. La parola all'onorevole Dornano.
Thank you, Ms. Dornano.
Thank you, Chair. Well, when we want to attack the exploitation of human beings, we have to approach things right. Thousands of clandestine refugee children who have disappeared over the last year have fed the networks of prostitution and modern slavery. This is the direct consequence of the migration policy of the Union, which is irresponsible. We're helping the clandestine flows of migrants and the mafias. And this is only covered in a timid article in this report. The exploitation of women for other people, and then other forms of reproduction. And women and children are being considered goods. Now, European legislation should not recognize this kind of horror. We have to fight against any kind of exploitation of human beings and treat the causes, the migration and neoliberalism. I'm sorry to disappoint certain idealists.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam. Ms. Vosenberg-Vriondini.
Micro, please.
Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε. Κυρία Επίτροπε, ξέρετε ότι η εκμετάλλευση...
Thank you. Madam Commissioner, you know that the exploitation of human beings for a lucrative purpose is in fact the most widespread form of organized crime that we have. We're talking about a turnover of billions and billions for this particular line of activity. Now we have a legal framework, a framework which sets out the rights of victims and the protection of victims. The problem, however, arises in the implementation of these texts, particularly if we're talking about the victims of tomorrow. Very often, victims are reluctant to come forward to make accusations. Often the information is incomplete, and therefore it's important for us to encourage victims. We need to encourage them to come forward, to speak out, and lodge accusations against their perpetrators, particularly the most vulnerable victims. We need to address our attention particularly to them, and of course public opinion at large. We're talking here of human dignity. Human dignity is not something that can be part of a business transaction. Human beings cannot be seen as some kind of merchandise, some kind of good. It is a disgrace for humanity and for the European Union and its values.
Ripeto anche per I colleghi che sono...
Even for those colleagues who've joined us later, I'm not in a position to allow a blue card session because we're too far behind schedule. So I must apologize for that, but it's important that we've been in a position to start votes at 12. Lots of members have to travel home. So I would like to ask colleagues to share some understanding for the need to respect time. Our next speaker is Ms. Neukel. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking once again today about human trafficking, and not human trafficking anywhere, just anywhere in the world, but human trafficking in Europe. Let's start by being a bit precise about the words we use here. This is actually a slave trade. We have to bear in mind the fact that we now have we have more slaves in Europe now than ever before in our history. All these people have been deprived of their rights, their dignity, their freedom and their human rights. Many speakers this morning have already stressed this. These people are enslaved in kitchens, cellars, prostitution and exploitation. We in the European Parliament are representatives of the people of Europe, and I think we must send out 3 clear messages to them. First of all, a clear message to human traffickers and to those who use slaves. And statistically speaking, that means that there are probably some users of slaves here in the European Parliament. This means that we have to make it clear that we will simply not tolerate this anymore. The clear message we have to send to victims is that we will not abandon you. We understand your suffering, even if it happens behind closed doors. We also have to send out a very clear message to society, which is that we have to provide information, information, information. Far too many people in Europe fail to recognize the true dimension of this slavery here in Europe.
Grazie, la parola.
Thank you, Ms. Gabriel.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, colleagues. I would like to commend our rapporteur for the excellent results. The full application of the directive for trafficking with people is the key to solving this problem. I will point out 4 elements. First and foremost, prevention. We need broad information campaigns on trafficking, including gender equality at a young age. Education and training are the main element of avoiding trafficking. Secondly, early identification and protection of victims. Member States should improve their systems of identification of victims. We should also increase the number of crisis centres for these victims. We should strengthen the programmes for their reintegration. Thirdly, follow the money. This is the main principle for criminal proceedings against this network that yields profits. Europol and Eurojust are very important here. And last but not least, cooperation with third countries. Europe or member states would be unable on their own to deal with this global challenge. We need a coordinated approach on a national, interinstitutional and international level so that we combat it. Miria Vassiliadou is the coordinator for combat trafficking. She's excellent and I would like to commend her on the good work. Thank you.
Onorevole Jotova.
Ms. Jotova.
Thank you, President. Parliament's findings are shocking. They show that there is a legal framework in place. Security agencies have taken action. However, that has yielded few results. to curb trafficking in women and children. Moreover, most victims and criminals come from European countries. The number of human rights instruments does not correspond to the results yielded. It is in European countries in the 21st century that we speak of white slaves, of trafficking of children. We are also facing new challenges. We are busy curbing migration and coping with the refugee crisis. However, we do little to dismantle the sophisticated smuggling networks that sell women on the black labour market for sexual or labour exploitation. Madam Jourova, the European Commission should step up control of the implementation of the Anti-Trafficking Directive, since very little is done for prevention and victim protection. We need better coordination among security services in order to dismantle transnational criminal networks.
Thank you. Moving on to Catch the Eye. Ms. Petir, first of all.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Commissioner. I would like to say that I condemn any type of trafficking in human beings, and we need to do everything we can to protect human dignity. Given that surrogacy is a modern form of trafficking and which hasn't been adequately regulated in many EU countries, and that the industry of surrogacy and surrogacy tourism are becoming ever more widespread, this report should have condemned this practice. Even more so given that we have already condemned it in the 2014 yearly report on human rights and democracy. I regret that the FAM committee, which should protect the dignity of women, wasn't interested in dealing with this problem. We cannot accept the fact that children are being sold and bought and female reproductive capacities are being rented out. How else can we call this but human trafficking? Women and children are not objects nor commodity, but human beings with their dignity. The Council of Europe refused to legalize surrogacy, and we should persist in prohibiting this as well. Thank you.
Mr. Caputo. Thank you, President. Prevention and enforcement against human trafficking are absolute priorities for the European Union. Strategies adopted when it comes to checking crime and protection for victims are multifold. However, so far the results aren't very satisfactory. We need an enormous effort on the part of the international community when it comes to tackling the sources of these inhumane and unacceptable situations. Human trafficking is not just the result of economic and social imbalances, it's also the result of gender imbalances. Structural imbalances mean that 80% of victims of human trafficking are females, women, girls and young girls. The trafficking of human beings can take many different forms. We have to ensure that we have an adequate response, which must be based on up-to-date analysis of recent trends, drawing on information regarding migratory flows which can be closely linked to human trafficking. Mr. Marias.
Thank you, Chair. Well, trafficking in human beings is one of the most serious crimes to be found in the world. It's a violation of fundamental rights. At international level, 80% of victims are women and young girls. In Europe, it's certainly 80%. And the aim is sexual exploitation, the abolition of organs, or forced labor. And there's a significant percentage of victims that come from marginalized minority groups. The significant migratory flows do make the problem more urgent, especially concerning minors. So it's imperative that in each one of our countries we have the means of locating the victims quickly and assisting them with appropriate means. We also have to work on equality between men and women and protect women and young girls.
Mr. Jakovic.
Over 10,000 people a year are victims of human trafficking. 70% of this are EU citizens. We do not stress this fact enough. Estimates are that 70% of these are EU citizens. 80%, unfortunately, are women and over 16% minors. We also hear that the business, if we can call it, is worth several billions of euros per year. Now, the other day we were discussing Europol, and those shedding tears over this topic did not want to help give more power to Europol the other day. We will not be able to combat this phenomenon because it is a cross-border issue. So I'm in favor of punishing the guilty parties, but to strengthen the Europol as well.
Ms. Saras-Fergut.
Gracias, presidente. Efectivamente.
Thank you, President. Indeed, we're talking here today about one of the new forms of slavery of the 21st century, most shameful business that we've experienced. And we're talking about not only an important issue, but also a violation of fundamental rights, human dignity, and it is also, of course, a fundamental violation of human rights. Victims remain invisible because they're afraid. They're afraid of retaliation. We're not just talking about sexual exploitation, we're talking about forced labor, forced begging, harvesting of organs, and business in that, or trade in that area. We're talking about something that is of relevance to all of us, and I'm turning to the Commission in particular because we're talking about millions of women around the world being tricked into this form of business. So it's an appeal to all of us, to all of our services. We need to look into this matter, inquire. We also need cooperation, we need dialogue between the different sectors, the judicial sector, police, health, and so on and so forth, and we need cross-border cooperation. And therefore, Commissioner, I would like to ask you to reply immediately, respond immediately, because, you know, for a year now we've been waiting for an answer. We need to make this issue a priority. It has to be one of the most important items on the agenda of the Commission altogether.
Thank you. And now, indeed, Commissioner, you have the opportunity to respond to the debate. Commissioner Jourová.
Honourable members of the European Parliament, I have listened to you here with great attention, and I want to reassure you that this is the priority for the European Commission, because and that I personally, sitting here and listening to you, share fully the sense of urgency. We see and we hear about the cases. Each individual story of a woman, of a young girl, of a child is a human tragedy, and we need to combat using all ways against these awful crimes against human dignity. And as I said before, we will continue addressing trafficking in human beings and work towards its eradication. We are now developing a post-2016 policy, and elements raised in this report will be considered very carefully. And I count on this Parliament's commitment and cooperation as a long-standing institutional partner for advancing our ambitious legal and policy framework to eradicate this scourge to our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I now invite the rapporteur, Mrs. Bearder. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your commitment to this issue, and it's very good to hear that Germany is now coming on board. I'd also like to thank my colleagues and shadows and the FEM Secretariat and ALDE for all their support and work on this, including those in my own office. Just a few points. Prostitution. Not all those in prostitution have been trafficked, and controlling prostitution is not an EU competence. And it's been a very fine line to talk about this in the report, but it is part of the market demand, and so that's how it's been addressed. Surrogacy is not trafficking. Forced surrogacy is a crime in anybody's language and also needs to be tackled. Migrants are not always victims of trafficking, but their vulnerability and their lack of care that we are affording them makes them very easy prey for the traffickers. Organised crime, yes, this is the fourth largest organised crime. It's much easier to traffic human beings than it is drugs. Police dogs don't smell out trafficked people. And for the lady who said that we should get out because it's free movement of people that causes it, the UK is in Schengen and yet it is still one of Europe's biggest markets for trafficked people. Traffickers don't care what sort of border control is there, they will work a way around it. We have all to be vigilant on this issue. I look forward to building on the progress that's been achieved by the Office of the Coordinator of Human Trafficking, Madame Vassilidou, and for all those who tonight and for the next forever knows how long face heaven knows what. We need all of us to be committed and vigilant and to work to make sure that we catch the traffickers and rescue those who are held in slavery. Thank you very much, everyone.
And thank you, Mrs Bearder, for your commitment. Colleagues, the debate is closed and we will vote on this resolution this afternoon. Our next item are debates on cases of breaches of human rights, democracy and the rule of law. The first item on the agenda is the Crimean Tatars. I want to announce, colleagues, that we are running behind schedule, so I will not be able to accept blue cards, and I may have to limit, if not take any catch the eye. I will try and take some. We will take names, but it may be difficult due to time pressures. So let me begin now on our debate on the Crimean Tatars and give the floor to Mr Rope for 1.5 minutes, please, one of the authors. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues. Today we are debating the EP resolution on the Crimean Tatars. This is the least we can do to help this unique ethnic group. I have no doubt that everyone in this hall condemns the illegal annexation of the Crimea, which happened 2 years ago. The occupants not only occupied the territory, but they also try to carry out what we can describe as ethnic cleansing. The Crimean Tatars were the first to be claimed to be accused of being criminals. In 1944, the Soviets announced that all Tatars were criminals, and then they deported them en masse. And this offence went unnoticed. It seems that Russia today is trying to do the same, try to repeat that offence. Crimean Tatars are again presented as criminals. The main representative body was banned. Crimean Tatars are being persecuted. And we have drafted a wonderful resolution which condemns the repressions by the Russian authorities, and will also speak in favour of the respect for fundamental and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to be more flexible on time, but I don't have that freedom or flexibility, so I'm going to be cruel. Apologies in advance. I now give the floor for 1 minute to Mr Corrao, please.
Thank you, Madam President. The mass deportation of